It really does make our campus a lot nicer to be able to go outside and see the normal Evergreen festivities happening on Red Square. You know, the juggling, the balancing, you know, that's when I know I'm at home, when I walk across Red Square and, you know, the things that I hold near and dear to my heart of what I think of first when I think of Evergreen is that scene. And as my first time on this campus as a student was in the spring of 1998, and that was one of the first things that I seen coming onto campus. But it was on the day of, I think, like the SNA Student Club's fair. And as a student of color, coming onto a campus in the middle of the woods and seeing things that I've never ever seen happen in an educational institution, such as juggling and acrobatics, and certain drumming and dancing, it really set the tone for the type of new world and environment I was entering in particular being a student of color on this campus. So this is the third in a series of talks based off of the email that Aisha Harris sent out in September, Coming Together. And I would always like to start off by going back to what was the content and the premise of that email. And it was for us to begin to talk about the ways that we interact with each other, our ability to support one another, but essentially the need for ongoing professional development around cultural competencies, because some of the things that happen to students of color on campus goes far beyond the impact that it has on them academically, but goes as far stretching into their lives outside of the classroom. And if we are going to be a socially conscious place and to really do what's right, then we should begin to have these discussions amongst ourselves and to work towards more equitable outcomes for all students. And Jossie started this conversation off earlier this year and really asked the questions on what does it take for equitable education to happen? And if it's not about giving something up, then what is it about? And we spent some time talking about that question during our follow-up seminars. And I think we begun a discussion, but the discussion needs to continue. And Robin DeAngelo came a couple of weeks later and talked to us about seeing the water, asking for white folks to see really what does your whiteness look like and how does it impact not only your lives, but the lives of everybody else. And we had more discussions about that. And there were some more personal questions that were asked. And those personal questions were asking people times that they have unintentionally or intentionally acted upon things that they were benefiting from being white. And I want to applaud the folks that have been coming to those follow-up seminars for really delving deep into attempting and starting to delve deep into these conversations. And so we're here on our third session. And I think it's a pretty opportune time to allow students to come up and to share some of their experiences as a way to welcome and introduce the topic of today. And the topic of today is good intentions aren't enough, the damaging effect of microaggressions. And as an advisor and a director, I often run into students or just sit down next to them and they start to list off these things that they've been going through and they've been encountering, right? And we just try to tell them to, keep pushing and keep it moving and things are gonna be okay. But there is a damaging effect to those things that add on to each other and add on to each other. And it leads me to the question that Robin asked of the people of color. And it was like, if you could if you could help white people understand one thing about racism, what would it be? And I think the one thing that that question has allowed me to come to the conclusion to, and which I think I knew the answer to before, but really, really made me come to the conclusion to, is that if I could help white people truly understand something about racism, is that it kills. And if we think about the structures and frameworks that are in place that promote killing, I think that we would all think about this work much differently. And it wouldn't be about white or black. It would be beyond those binaries. It's like, do we support people's lives not living to their fullest potential? Quality of lives being cut short because of stress, because of lack of medical attention, because of lack of opportunities. So I hope that we can really think about what it is when we talk about when we think about the impact of race and the frameworks and systems that are in place to kind of keep the status quo from keep going, and the effects that it has on other folks. So the first student that I'm going to call up, sorry for rambling, the first student that I'm going to call up is a student who's been in the TRIO program and a part of First Peoples, I think since they arrived on campus last year. Has been involved in intercollegiate sports here, played on the women's basketball team, currently an RA, and somebody who I really trust to provide me honest feedback of what the climate really is like on campus. And I would like for Shamerica to come on up and share a piece that she has written about her experiences here at Evergreen to start off our day. Thank you.
Hello. So I didn't have a title for this, but I got a title now. It's called Evergreen's Colors. Welcome to the system of education, to the education system, I mean. The very education my ancestors were forbidden to learn. Yet they understood the understood, bringing understanding to the misunderstanding. The system gifted from Prussia, wrapped by the founding father of the Nazis, to wipe your creativity and make you the perfect soldier. Never question authority. Yet I've seemed to have crash-landed on some strange utopia form of this system. The diversity has me hooked. I want more. I want all I can get. I mean, after all, my very name is a symbol of leadership. Here, you can be who you want. Here, it's okay to speak in class without raising your hand. I can be who I want? Wow, I like this place. Finally, I can forget that I am a black woman striving through a system that was never designed for me, because being successful is a threat, and education is the key. But once you get it, to welcome your new journey, you get to the door to find out that the locks have been changed. On sunny days, people smile, joy is walking, and laughter is sprinting. Where are the people that reflect me? The diversity they sold me is smeared. The teachers to teach. I am a student to soak your version of this system. But it is difficult to focus when I am in a class focused on issues of minority, lack of resources, and racism. When a question is asked, everyone looks to me for conclusion, for reassurance in their statements. Yet no one notices how uncomfortable they are making me. Do they see the silencing on my face? Do they feel the hurt being caused by their actions? Notice that your freedom to express is causing pain. Everyone is incarcerated in one way or another. I need you to realize I am trying to break generations of torture, bring life to forgotten legacies, pave the way for the next black girl. This place is a field of flowers, and I plan to water, love, and cherish every blade of grass. My queen, I am a direct reflection of your dream. I am breaking generational curses. Thank you for your sacrifice to see me grow. I will now pay it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamarika. So we're gonna have one more student come up, and a student that's a first-year student here at Evergreen, from up north in Renton, high school direct. Hold on a second. A student that was a part of the Scholars Program, correct, Jana? Right? And has been actively involved in the TRIO program this entire year, and now is currently an internship with doing an internship with us. And with having the opportunity to have Jana in the TRIO class, I was really able to see the talents that she has with artistic expression of spoken word. So really, I think that we should be honored and privileged to have another speaker come up and share with us the title of her poem, Ethnically Ambiguous. Jana Williams.
Hey everyone, I just want to clarify it's a speech, but no, it's okay. All right, let me fix this. How many in this room have ever felt uncomfortable in their skin because they're not white? How many have pride in their culture? How many have masked their true identity just to fit in? How many have witnessed racial profiling more than once and felt powerless even while knowing how pathetic and rotten the situation was? Well, I had a pathetic and rotten situation occur on my way to NAACP AXO competition a few years ago, and I'd like to share with you my experience. I take a deep breath and close my eyes, just enough time to relax before hitting ground level. Thank you for flying with Delta Airlines. We hope to see you again. I gracefully grabbed my bags and stood in line. A white flight attendant greeted every exiting passenger with a smile and a simple goodbye. Yet when it was my turn to exit, she glared at me. I tried to avoid eye contact, but she spoke. You are a mutt, and I want you to know that. For the very first time, I never felt so hated and confused about something that I cherish and take pride in, my identity. For the next 4 minutes, I will share with you the beauty and struggles of being ethnically ambiguous. I'm Hawaiian, Portuguese, and Black. What does ethnically ambiguous mean? People whose racial or ethnic heritage is difficult to determine based off their looks alone. I like to consider myself a human being like everyone else, yet based on society standards, we're classified by neat checkboxes that say Black, white, or other. I grew up in a neighborhood that represents the most diverse zip code in the nation, 98178, where Black, white, Asian, and Latino are all integrated in one community. I come from a family where one nationality is celebrated, honored, and acknowledged. As I hit my teenage years, I realized this is not the case for most people in the world. In fact, being considered mixed is misunderstood and unacceptable by many people of this nation, by those who are Black and white. Yet my parents are the product of the Civil Rights Movement era. We are a nation that preaches freedom, diversity, and equality as the strongest assets of our country. However, outside of my family and hometown, I'm easily judged and stereotyped based off my features and skin color. Even worse, I'm degraded to a mutt. How does this allow us to be our true selves? As individuals, we are unique, yet society demands we identify ourselves by labels, color, status, or prestige. We fall into this routine of unjust actions towards one another, and this is the sum of one's existence. This so-called box or pyramid is unrealistic. We, including those who are white, are not meant to fit in little boxes that satisfy the Census Bureau or some flight attendant. The whole point of establishing well-known organizations such as NAACP and Latino student unions or minority fairs on college campuses is meant to celebrate and enhance young people like myself to be empowered like myself to speak out against injustice and bigotry we experience every day. I feel each and every one of us is ethnically ambiguous, not just by race, but by the way we connect with one another, by our values and beliefs, music we listen to, clothes we wear, and languages we speak. We are all a unique blend of cultures, heritage, and traditions. We all have a purpose in life, and that is to look deep within ourselves versus degrading one another. Part of human nature is that we're not always supposed to agree, but we must find commonalities and respect one another because it's simply the right thing to do. If I could go back in time and respond to that flight attendant, I would gladly say, interesting. A mutt means a dog of parents with different breeds, and I am not a dog. I am a humanitarian, an artist, a friend, a sister, a daughter. I am simply me, Jana Len Williams. And I suggest you do some self-evaluating and ask yourself, who are you? Thank you.
Thank you, Shamerika, and thank you, Jana. Really, we cannot continue to have these conversations without having more student voices. So if there's any students that feel that they got something to offer, please don't feel free to reach out to me in the future because there's a space for you. So I would like to introduce a person that I've known. I believe the first time that I met Yoshiko Harden was at Highline College, and it was a part of a faculty learning community. And she was hosting this faculty learning community at Highline. And I believe the whole premise of that faculty learning community was, do you remember that? Was to help the community and technical colleges have some required diversity courses on their campuses. And during that time, she was the director of multicultural services and student development. And she was able to rock it at Highline. And she really made a change and really made an impact. And soon afterwards became the only, or one of the first, vice presidents of diversity at Bellevue College. And as far as I know, has been able to really implement some policies and practices within hiring and other programs on campus to really change the outcomes for students of color. But what she shared with me earlier today is that there's also a ceiling when work gets categorized as diversity work. And in order for true equity to happen, it needs to be work across all divisions and not left up to the Diversity Center or the other programs that work with underrepresented populations. So I don't know if she's gonna get mad for me for sharing this, but she has recently accepted a position at Seattle Central as a vice president of student affairs. Because if the work of equity is really gonna happen on these campuses, it's not just gonna come out of the diversity and multicultural offices. It has to be the work that is a priority of every division that has anything to do with students. And I think that's every office on this campus. So thank you for bringing that to my attention, Yoshiko, and I would like to introduce Yoshiko Harden to the stage.
Hi, thanks. Turn my. Well, good afternoon. Cool. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank Felix and staff and anyone that was responsible for extending an invitation to me. This is the first time I've been able to visit this campus, so it's been nice to spend the afternoon here. Yeah, so I'm glad you all know my next job. It actually wasn't public, so thanks, Felix. But it's all good. We're in the woods. So Kona silence, all right? It's not a big deal. The people that need to know, so it's great. But yeah, maybe at the end we can talk more about that transition or how I see that work moving forward. So I'm Yoshiko Harden. I'm currently the Vice President for Diversity at Bellevue College and their Chief Diversity Officer. I've been there for about 3.5 years. Prior to that, I was at Highline College in different capacities, but in student services and mostly in multicultural student development work. So I always say I got into higher education because I wanted to create the experience I always wanted but never received at UC San Diego, University of Washington, Seattle University, City College in San Diego, and now I'm currently working on my doctorate at Northeastern. So that's why I got, and I purposely chose community college as the realm. That was the student population I wanted to work with. Today I'm going to speak about the topic of my doctoral study, which is racial microaggressions. And how many folks are familiar with microaggressions? Great. So there's lots of knowledge in the room, and we'll have an opportunity maybe to talk about how you're thinking about microaggressions. The title of this talk is Good Intentions Aren't Enough, and I borrowed that from Paul Gorski. He's a great multicultural scholar and anti-racist educator, and he has an essay called Good Intentions Aren't Enough, and it's about kind of multicultural education and problematizing this kind of trend towards multicultural education and how it really actually is a reiteration of kind of white hegemony and white supremacy, but couched in multicultural language. So that essay was really a pivotal moment for me, and I started thinking about that as it relates to microaggressions. While I was at Highline, I was a student advisor, so I worked with students a lot, and they would talk to me about their experiences on campus. And it was things like, well, I was asked to leave my bag outside of the bookstore, but no one else was asked. Or I was told when I parked in the staff parking lot that it was only for staff, and they were actually a staff person, right? So it was all of these kind of things that don't really rise to the level of overt, like racism, right? There wasn't really a name for that. And so when I came across an article back in 2008 about microaggressions, it really clicked for me. So that's what I want to focus on today. Just to kind of give you a brief overview. So I think I want to accomplish 3 things with the group. Kind of define and identify individual and institutional types of microaggressions, because it's not just on a personal level, and also thinking about strategies that we can use to disrupt or problematize microaggressions. And I'll give some examples of the work that Felix alluded to in the introduction. So does that sound good? All right, cool. I love this quote by Ridley, and it's titled, Unintentional Behavior is Perhaps the Most Insidious Form of Racism. Unintentional racists are unaware of the harmful consequences of their behavior. Because individuals, groups, institutions, vice presidents, faculty, right, do not wish to do harm, it is difficult to get them to see themselves as racists. And I think this is really a powerful context for as we think about what rises to the level of really racist, right? And what the literature on microaggressions argues is that 80% of what's happening are these kind of not unintentional or overt, conscious, subconscious comments, acts, behaviors. And that's what we're seeing on our campuses. And I think like Harvard did a big thing on microaggressions where they had students with signs saying, you know, microaggressions that they face, so some visual work. Kind of similar to kind of this subversive artwork that's going around. Like, so folks, juveniles who are in a criminal justice system, right, but they're more than just someone who's incarcerated, right? So thinking about it that way. This slide is titled Diversity as a Value versus a Fundamental. And the way I think about it, and this is where I see colleges and universities trip up. So we say we value diversity, and it might be in our mission statement or our vision statement, maybe in our department mission statements, and yet it doesn't really show up as fundamental to the way we do business. So I value working out. Anyone else value that? Okay. You see where I'm going with this, right? And yet, the last time I worked out, I think I've worked out twice this year, right, in 2016. Every day I say, I have my gym bag in the car. Driving down here today, I thought, I might go to the gym. I'm not going to the gym. I'm gonna be tired, right? But I value it, right? I value honesty. Guess what? Like, I've told lies, right? So I value respect, and I've disrespected people. So which tells me is you can hold something as a value and not really have to engage in it on a daily basis, on a regular basis, or in a meaningful basis. And that's what I see in the post-secondary context, right? We could argue K through 12 in all of our educational system. It's something we value, but when it comes time, if it happens, it's nice, and if it doesn't happen, well, we meant well, right? Which doesn't change the outcomes. Diversity, right, is just the term diversity, right? It exists in social systems. We all have diverse experiences, backgrounds that we bring into this room. I argue that equity and inclusion are intentional. Those are the policies, the practices, the changes that we implement to make a more equitable college or university. I know there's many words on this slide, but I just wanted to give a sense of kind of terminology for the purposes of this talk that I want to use. So social justice, trying to ensure people get an equitable distribution of resources, right? That's justice. Equality is that treating everyone the same. Equity is making sure people get what they need. So how many folks have been to the emergency room or urgent care? Okay. So when you're in the waiting room, right, there's people there with all different types of needs, right? Someone might have a fever, someone might be having heart pain, someone could have their eyeball hanging out, right? Someone could have a broken limb, right? So everyone's there for service. So the equality model is when the doctor comes out and says, today's Tylenol day. Everyone's getting Tylenol. So you're getting Tylenol even though your eye's hanging out, and you're getting Tylenol because you have a fever, and you're getting Tylenol because your ankle's broken, right? That's equality, right? And we have to go in order. So although your eye's hanging out, we're gonna take the person that has the fever because they were here first, right? The equity model is that people get what they need, and that's the difference. You know, power in a structural sense, right? So Gramsci would argue around hegemony is getting people to do what you want, even when it's not in their best interest, right? And the fact that you don't even need to force them. He argued that the state can intervene, right, through military or other types of force, but hegemony operates that we just participate in it. Prejudice is a prejudgment or belief, a privilege, unearned benefits. Oppression is that combination of prejudice and power, and then isms, right, forms of oppression based on group membership. So that's kind of the language I'm gonna use today. Is anyone familiar with adaptive leadership? It's a systems, theory, change model, which there's lots that have to do with adaptive leadership. What I like for the purposes of this talk and thinking about how do we disrupt systems, how do we disrupt Evergreen State College so that the college can meet the outcomes it says it wants, right? In terms of equitable distribution of resources, in terms of serving our most marginalized students. So what adaptive leadership argues is that there are no broken systems. How many of you have heard this phrase, like the system's broken? I've said it, right? It's just the system's broken. Adaptive leadership actually argues that there are no broken systems, right? They produce the results they were designed to produce, right? And adaptive leadership says, actually, the system works perfectly because it wasn't designed to be equitable, right? And higher ed is the perfect example, right? If we go back to the origins of higher education, it was never designed to be an equitable system. So there are no broken systems. Another thing that I think is really useful coming from adaptive leadership for equity work is this idea that our values are prioritized at the point of execution. So at my college, we have this on our kind of president's cabinet agenda to keep in mind as we're making decisions, right? That when we make a decision, we're actually prioritizing our values. And if we say our value is serving the most marginalized, the most underrepresented students, and yet what we're pursuing is in conflict in that, then that's not really our value. And I was meeting with a group a little earlier, just kind of on a quick conversation, and we were talking about, you can't have it both ways, right? We act on our priorities. So either it's a priority and we're gonna act on it, or it's not a priority. And that's how we're gonna, and I'm fine either way, but you told me it was a priority. Right? I didn't make it up. I didn't come to Bellevue College and say, this is the college's priority, right? The position was already there. So I really like that quote. The other piece is, if change is the goal, then the status quo is your enemy. And what they say in adaptive leadership, every time, all the time, that it's counter status quo work. So if I'm doing my job right, it's all counter status quo. And if I'm going with the system, then that means I'm not operating from social justice. And that can get tricky because I'm part of an institution, right? And one of the roles of vice presidents, which is really interesting, is to protect the college, right? It's about making decisions that ultimately protect the college, and sometimes they're not in the best interest of students, or they conflict with students. So bias incidents come to my office, and in the 3.5 years that I've been there, there have been some cases that I thought, oh yeah, like the college is definitely at fault. This was definitely discrimination based off of ability or disability or race, and so then I push it through to HR to bring in the investigator. And every single one has come back, no findings, no findings, no findings, no findings. And that's because the college, right, the value is to be equitable, the value is to, right, but when we have to go against ourselves as the institution, it comes back to things like it was a miscommunication. Or one of the things people say to me when there's a complaint primarily against faculty, so at my college we call it's tenure. Felix was saying here it's conversion. Is that correct? Okay. Is that right? Okay, I learned something new. So one of the first questions someone will say if it's a complaint against a faculty member, well, are they adjunct? Are they part-time, or are they tenured? And if they're adjunct, they're like, whoo, okay, we can do something. And if they're tenured, it's like, well, you know, I'm not so sure. I see some heads nodding. That doesn't happen here, does it? Okay. If they're tenured, it's like, well, you know, but tenure was never about protection from, you know, never being held accountable for doing something wrong. That was not the goal of tenure around academic freedom, right? It was protection from different things. So if change is the goal, then the status quo is the enemy all the time. So I've kind of broken this down into a section talking about individual microaggressions, and then we'll move into institutional microaggressions. So the term microaggressions, racial microaggressions, was actually coined by Chester Pierce, who's a black psychologist out of Harvard in the 70s. He largely does not get credited for coining this term, but he has really kind of radical writings that he wrote in the 70s around race and racism and patriarchy and sexism, which are really interesting. Daryl Wing Su from the counseling psychology field kind of picked it up, and he and others have largely been kind of pushing it forward. So that might be some of the work that you all see. They've published a lot on microaggressions and different types, so LGBTQ, gender, disability, language. Most recently, some folks have been taking it and applying it to the higher ed context. So how they define it is microaggressions are conscious, unconscious, verbal, or nonverbal comments or actions. They tend to be messages that convey social bias, right? They're often stated as compliments. So you speak English so well, right? Or compliments that have been said to me, I don't think of you as black, right? You're not like other black people. So until they told me that, I didn't realize there were two types of black people, right? Kind of this acceptable and unacceptable version of black people. They tend to further denigrate and invalidate already marginalized groups, so people of color, lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, intersex, women, people with disabilities, and so on. Now, if you only leave with two things today, it would be the last two bullets that are really critical to understanding microaggressions, and that is accumulation is key. That is the cumulative effects of microaggressions, right? And sometimes we see that in the college context where something happens in the financial aid line, right? And a student has a very strong reaction or is disrespectful, and it's like, that behavior is unacceptable. And then you talk to the student, and this was like the fourth time today where they've gone somewhere and we're told something wasn't right, right? It's the cumulative piece. And so I think for people in dominant group, it can be very difficult to understand, like, what's the big deal? Like, behavior is behavior. And then the second piece is that it's perception of the victim, not the intent. So what I perceive to be a microaggression, Felix may not perceive to be a microaggression. So one of my pet peeves is when I'm asked for my picture ID when I use my credit card, because I'm old enough to remember a time when just your signature was enough, right? The card just needed to be signed. And so now when I go and I just kind of wait for it, right? So if any of you have seen Unnatural Causes, it talks about this anticipation yet you're going to experience discrimination and the negative health outcomes associated with that. So I'm already kind of ready. Anyone do that? Like, okay, we're going in. Nothing that needs to happen. You just think something might happen. And so my mom's white. So one of the things we like to do just for fun is I let her go first when we're shopping. And because no one thinks we're together, right? And she is never asked. And I come, and I'm not always asked, but most of the time I am asked for my ID. So I'll do things like, I'll just say why. So someone will say, oh, I need to see your ID. And I'll say, why? And I've heard that sometimes it will say, like, I'm not racist. So that's a strategy you can do with microaggressions, right? You just play like you don't know what's going on, because microaggressions rely on all of us understanding kind of this dominant narrative, right? About who's acceptable, who's not, who's a threat, who's not, right? They're very closely associated with stereotypes. So I'll just say, why? And they'll say, oh, I'm not racist. Or I've heard, you don't look like your name. Or they'll say, which is okay. Or they'll say, it's the law, which is not, because I went back and researched it. All right, so that's just one of the strategies. So I'll say to someone, like, I don't want you to know my home address, right? I'll flip it back on them, like, I don't want you to know where I live. And usually people calm down. But when I'm with my daughter, who's 15, she starts to get upset, like I'm making a scene. We were at Target in Kent. That's where I live, Kent. So when you live in Kent, you can say things like Kent. So we were in Target on a Saturday. I don't know how many of you have gone to a busy place on a Saturday, but Target in Kent is very busy. And I was paying for my items. I'd only come for 2 things, so we were at about $190 at checkout. And the cashier was there, and I had 2 $100 bills. I don't know why. I don't know where I got it, but I was happy. So I had 2 $100 bills, and I gave him the money. And he stopped, and I expected him to kind of look at it, right? And he was like, and he got out the pen, and he marked it, and then he turned off the little light, and he said, not to really me, there were about 10 people behind me. I don't know who he was saying it. He said, this is gonna take a while. And he called over the white manager, and she came over. No one acknowledged me, and I just kept saying this, I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you're doing this, you know. No one acknowledged me, and she came over, and she looked at them, and then she said, just take them. If they're bad, it's on me. And it was just a really interesting, that's just like a day in the life, but that's the key part with understanding microaggressions, because sometimes people try and talk you out of it, and they say, well, maybe it's because, what they're wearing. Or maybe it's because they're SAG, or maybe they had the headphones. Or I'm like, I'm a middle-aged black woman, right? It's not because what I'm wearing, right? And the thing with microaggressions is you can't rule it out, right? So was it racially motivated? I don't know, but I can't rule it out. And that's the point. Sue breaks microaggressions down into 3 types. So this is the first, which is micro-assault. And micro-assaults are defined as they're often conscious, right? So they're on purpose. It's intentional. They tend to be explicit, overt acts. They can be violent, verbal and nonverbal. You see it's an image of kind of the burning cross and the KKK, right? So when many of us think of racism, we might associate with kind of this type of kind of white supremacy group or white identity group. Examples could be hate crimes or hate speech. So in the last 3 or 4 weeks at Bellevue College, we've had a person defacing bathrooms. So last year we were able to convert all our single stall restrooms to all gender, and 2 of our, thank you, it was a trip. 2, that value versus fundamental. and we have 4 restrooms that were previously identified male and female, multi-stall, converted to all gender, because our students were like, y'all are late to the game. You know, like, this is our normal. And I was getting a lot of pushback around converting multi-stall. It was kind of like, well, safety. I'm like, it already is a safety issue. Well, harassment, people are already getting harassed. It's just not the people you care about, right? It's already a safety issue. So someone's been going around writing things like F Muslims, F LGBTQ, right? These micro assaults. And facilities comes and kind of paints over them, and the next day it's back again. So I was trying to figure this out, but that would be kind of this overt act. Micro insults are the second type of microaggression, according to Sue and others. So those are often unconscious, so the person doesn't really know they're doing them. They tend to be rude, insensitive, demeaning. So the cashier that said, this is gonna be a while, and the woman that came by and said, take them, they probably didn't realize, right, what they were doing. And they tend to strip away someone's dignity, right? It's that micro insult. So some examples, I gave one already. I don't see you as black. Assuming a person of color was hired because of their race. This policing and profiling, right, and killing of black and brown people, trans people, right, those would be kind of examples. Sue has broken it down into themes, ascription of intelligence, so that goes to the model minority myth. Well, you must be good at math. I present to a high school in Bellevue every once in a while, and the students there were telling me, particularly Asian students, were telling me they have a new term they call an Asian fail, right, associated with this model minority myth. Well, you're an Asian fail because you're not an academically A student. Second-class citizen, so they convey this like you're not American kind of status. So I don't get asked, I might get asked where I'm from, but I don't get the follow-up originally, right? And like they come in like, no, does anyone get that one? Okay. So that people are satisfied to stop with me, and that's what it says in the literature, that most folks who get the where are you from originally are Asian, API, or perceived, because there's a lot of misidentification, right? Or Latino, that people are kind of guessing. And I think the poem that the young woman, right, kind of captured that, this kind of ethnically ambiguous, who are you? They tend to pathologize cultural values and communication styles or dress, right? So like, they're so loud, right? They're so gay acting, right? This idea, like, what are they wearing? How come they have to dress that way, right? So when Trayvon Martin was killed, remember the whole national dialogue around the hoodie? It was the hoodie that set it off. So is anyone here wearing a hoodie? Right. All right, this pathologizing, it's not because he was a young black male walking in a neighborhood, it was because of what he was wearing, right? The hoodie was threatening. It's this assumption of criminality, right? This potential threat prone to violence. So as a black woman, right, I'm very cognizant of this because when I think about stereotypes associated with black women, I really can't think of any positive stereotypes, right, or good ones. They're overwhelmingly, so at my job, if I'm just communicating, sometimes people will say, well, don't get angry, right? And I'm like, well, now I say, well, you should be angry too, right? Everyone should be angry about injustice, right? So of course I'm angry. Absolutely, you should be too. We have my partner, he's a black male, and he had his daughter down at the bus stop in front of our house, and she was talking to our neighbor friend. So the three of them were out there, and her parents just pulled up and said, get in the car, our neighbors. And then she was like, no, I'm talking, I don't want to. And they were like, so she got in the car and left, right? Like that level, this assumption, this threat. Micro-invalidations. So Sue argues that micro-invalidations are the most harmful, if you think about microaggressions. Because they negate someone's experiential reality, right? You're basically saying, oh, what you're experiencing isn't real, or that's not what it is. They can be conscious or unconscious. So examples are this kind of when you bring up race, like everything isn't about race, right? Or everyone has the same it's just, it's linked to the myth of meritocracy, right? It's just work ethic. Everybody has the same opportunity. So if we look at Fortune 500 companies, right, just kind of the mass traded companies, how many CEOs of those companies are led by people who identify as women? How many? 2? It's 5. Any other guesses? Okay, well, the answer is 20 out of 500. And it's the highest it's ever been since they've been tracking it. So I know not every woman wants to be a CEO of a company, but I know it's more than 20, which tells us when you look at the data that women earn degrees at the same or higher rate than men, that women are in the workforce at the same or higher rate than men, right? That somehow in the C-suite, if they aspire or not, there's 20 spaces. That tells us something systemic is happening. It's not because, right, X group is a better leader, but when you look at the characteristics we associate with leadership or traditional leadership, what are they? We're going to think of a leader. So male, so logical, male, rational, decision maker, charismatic. Any others? Educated, aggressive, appropriately aggressive, right? Not afraid. They're passionate. So I have a white colleague who will hit the table in meetings, and I'll tell him you can't hit tables, and he's like, yes, I can, and he's right? Because he's passionate. He's so passionate about student success that it's taken as a positive, not as a threatening behavior. And then when we look at what are the kind of stereotypes we associate with women? Adjectives. Irrational, great. Passive, emotional. What else? Illogical. You're good. You're firing today. Come up here and do the talk. Any others? Nurturing. Right? I read a great paper where it talks about kind of women as collaborative, this kind of stereotype that we're collaborative. The author was arguing, women might not be collaborative, we've just had to be to work in institutions that we're probably no more collaborative than, say, men are, right? But it's a coping mechanism, a strategy. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So you see the disconnect in just and that's in very general terms, but we see it show up in other places. So at this point, I think it'd be great if you can work with a partner, maybe 2 folks. So I want you to do what stands out to you about racial microaggressions or microaggressions and why. So you can pick what you want to discuss. A time when you experienced a microaggression or a time when you committed a microaggression. So does everyone have a partner, a buddy? Okay, so let's take about 5 minutes and do that.
Time for that question. If we have a question, I think it's always good. If you have time.
I should be able to wrap this up in the next.
So you have HR question. I'm not even hiding in the corner.
I'm doing that.
They have to go and do their student thing. Shayna, she got it, right? She's 18.
She said, she stood back. I said, okay.
Sure.
Right. Okay, 2 more minutes. Okay, let's hear from a few groups. Who would like to share the larger group what they talked about? Any volunteers? Okay, well, you all were talking. I'll use my deep observation skills to say I observed talking. Hopefully you were talking about the assignment. This is Evergreen. Okay, good. He's schooling me. The president of Valencia College has a great quote where she says, culture will eat strategy for breakfast every time. So you just schooled me a little bit on the culture, so thank you for that. My strategy may not work, but we're gonna try one more time. Anyone want to share the larger group? Okay, great. We have a microphone, Felix, thank you.
Oh, perfect. I guess one of the things we talked about in terms of racial microaggressions is the fact that the impact versus the intent on someone when someone says something and then they realize, if they realize that it was something that was hurtful or harmful to the community, it's supposed to somehow make it better by saying, that wasn't my intention, or that wasn't that I didn't mean it that way. And so at the end of the day, I don't really care that you didn't mean it that way. That's the fact of the matter is it came across in a way that is now hurtful or harmful. And the other part about that is the impact on the communities that it happens to. So if it's something racial, if it's something homophobic, if it's something transphobic, the degree to which it's now becoming internalized by the communities that are hearing it, no one really ever stops to think about it before they say something. How is this impacting the person I am now saying it to? And more importantly, how is this becoming something that's so internalized that someone actually begins to believe what's being said about them? So maybe this is me. Maybe I am, and similar to what Jana said, maybe I am a mutt. Maybe I am someone that's unworthy of the things that are, I guess, not happening to me, of the respect that I'm and the dignity that I'm allowed as a human being. So I just thought it was interesting, the fact that some of these microaggressions, people think that racism is dead and it's not a thing anymore, and we've had a black president, so now we're all colorblind, and that's not the case. Racism is alive and well, and it's just taking on different forms, and microaggressions is one of those forms.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So one of the things I always say is if I come up and punch you in the face, what happens? You can go ahead and say what you're thinking. You get punched back. I know what you're
I'm pissed.
Right.
I'm upset.
But if I come up and punch you, and then I'm like, oh, my bad. I don't know what happened. Like, my bad, I didn't mean it. Right, the result is, right, you're still punched, or you've still been abused, you've still been struck, you've still been shamed, you know, all of those things, regardless of my intent. And I think that's a really critical point when we're talking about privilege, right? One of the things they say in adaptive leadership is a fish doesn't know it's wet. Right? That's the epitome of privilege. So myself as a heterosexual woman, although I personally don't hold homophobic views, I benefit from homophobia and heterosexism regardless of my personal views. So when we're thinking about race, sometimes white people get tripped up because they're like, that's not me, right? That I don't hold those views. And that might be true, but you benefit, right, from white hegemony, white supremacy, white privilege, regardless if you hold personal views towards communities of color or not. And that's the piece. And so that's where we take it from the individual into the systemic, right? And that's where you see where no systems are broken. Thank you, that was a great comment. Other brave soul would like to share? Yes, Gabriel in the middle.
We talked about kind of about the accumulation, and that, like, for myself, there's certain microaggressions that I've experienced pretty much my whole life and gotten used to the point where I try to find creative ways to convey. Like one, I was in a grocery store or produce section, and an older white woman came up and very gently but offensively asked if she could touch my hair. Oh, can I touch your hair? You know, and as she moved in, I said, yeah, can I touch yours too? And I just held it until she let go of mine. I said, all right.
That's a great strategy. That's a great strategy, right? Wonderful. There's another hand. Let's hear from a couple more people. Over here, Felix.
I can't see, I'm blinded.
Oh, come towards me. And then walk forward to the third row and stop. To your right. There you go.
I wanted to add to something that you had just said, because it wasn't related to what we had discussed, but the idea of sort of the microaggression as a newer form of manifestations of racism, where the microaggressions have perhaps always existed, but that the not so micro insults or micro assaults, you know, that have sort of gone the wayside, that there are fewer of them, hopefully, systemically, but that you have people who still hold these racist, homophobic viewpoints, but if they're not enacting obvious assaults,
Right.
that therefore they are not racist or transphobic,
Yes.
even though they hold all the views still and commit the microaggressions.
Yes, and I think there's a layer to that too, which in sociology they call it front stage, backstage, right? This idea, any sociologists, I'm not officially trained, but I'm partnered with a sociologist, so where in the front stage, we know what's kind of acceptable or unacceptable behavior, right? That in the front stage in a higher ed context, coming forward and saying, I'm not for diversity, would be met with like, ooh, you can't, how could you be a part of this community, right? In the backstage, those conversations are happening all the time, right? But with people that either are like-minded, so there's around race, like with passing, so I have 13 brothers and sisters. Some of them, we're all biracial, right? So some of them would pass visually as white. They have a different experience than I do because people assume they're white in so many settings. And then it's kind of like, you know, they hear the jokes or the comments. So they navigate it differently. Leslie House-Pica has a great book called Race in the Front Stage and Backstage, where they gave 1,200 white college students journals and just asked them to document incidents of race, just how it came up in their everyday life. And what was very interesting, a lot came around racial joking, this perceived threat, and coded language. So a lot of the students worked in like service restaurant, and there were a lot of racial codes where they wouldn't say black, right? So they would say things like, ooh, it's a blackout today, or it's sure dark outside. So if you weren't part of that group, you didn't really know they were talking about black people, right? So there's a lot around racially coded language that I would say happens in the kind of the front stage and the backstage. And so when people slip up, like we can think on a national level, right, when there's that rupture, and it's like, ooh, like it came forward, like Mel Gibson, or the Kramer guy, right, from Seinfeld, Or I didn't watch Grey's Anatomy. Was it like the black dude who started saying all this homophobic stuff, right? The backstage moves into the front stage. Now, usually someone comes forward and says, they're the least racist person, right? Like Whoopi Goldberg, right? She always vouches for Mel Gibson, right? Like they're the least racist person ever. That was not their intent. So you see how this perpetuates itself. Those are great comments. Before I move to the next one, anyone just dying to speak? Yes, we have a hand in the back. Great.
So I guess mine is more of a question.
Sure.
So the first question you have up there is what stands out about microaggressions, and I was just talking about it with my friend, and I think, I don't want to be this person, but the thing that stands out to me most about the word microaggressions is that it's micro. Because I think you said that in the beginning of your slide, you broke it down into micro assaults and then micro
Insults and micro-validation.
And micro-validations, and there's just like a picture of a burning cross and the KKK in front of it, and I just think that when people outside of this room maybe, or when people look at this slide even, they think, oh, microaggressions, this is some other theory that they've thought of against like diversity and how people treat black people and things like that. And the reason they think about that is because they see the word microaggressions, and it's small, and it's person to person and things like that, and it's a bunch of those tiny things that make up kind of a macro, something that's humongous.
Yes.
So I didn't know, I'm embarrassed to say this is my first time hearing the entire like word and what it's about, but I didn't know if there was something in the paper that the guy wrote from Harvard or something like that, so where he like came up with this term, or like how it all started, because it just seems a little small to me.
Oh, are you referring to Chester Pierce, the person that coined the term?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So the word I've been able to find where he talks about racial microaggressions is a chapter in another book. And he's talking about it in terms of the media and how it perpetuates racism via racial microaggressions. So he doesn't talk about how he came up with that. But you can Google him, or
Okay.
I can send you what I have.
Okay,
Because it was hard to find, yeah. But thank you for your comment. So many of you maybe talked about this or kind of alluded to this when we spoke out, but this kind of resistance and reaction. So once you've experienced the microaggression, right, a few things tend to happen. Sue would argue this moment of disbelief. So you might, because you're just cruising along with your day, so you might like, did that really happen? But, you might check if you're with someone, like, did that happen? Or you text, right? We see on social media posts, right? It's like, I'm standing at store number 421, and right now it's like, is this really happened? That moment of disbelief. Another piece is this psychic energy, that it takes so much energy to go about your daily life with the thought of either you're going to experience a microaggression, even if you do or not. So Smith has a great article called Racial Battle Fatigue, where he talks about the accumulation of racial microaggressions leads to racial battle fatigue. And the symptoms of racial battle fatigue are things like hopelessness, anxiety, depression, anger, sadness, kind of lethargy. I think when the student spoke earlier, she described feeling unfocused, or the inability to focus on her work because of the larger climate here. So I think as educators and practitioners, where we are doing a disservice is if that we're not looking at a student and thinking holistically. Like, okay, I wonder what their experience might be like as a student of color at Evergreen State College. And they're describing kind of anxiety and depression, right? And I'm talking to them about time management, right? That might not be the issue. So that's a great article. I'll be happy to send it to Felix if he wants to send it out to folks. You can confront the perpetrator, right? Which Sue says is a catch-22, because sometimes people are like, then I'm just acting into the stereotype, right? So if a stereotype for black women is we're angry, and then I respond angrily, I see Rashida laughing. Has this happened to you? Okay. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to share, go ahead, right? And then so you weigh that out. Or sometimes I'm with my daughter, like, do I want to ruin her time, right? It's gonna change things. So it's kind of, you have to make these decisions in a very 8 to 10 seconds. Or you do nothing, and then later on, like, dang, I wish I would have said something, right? How come I just, so my advice is that a conversation doesn't have to be over, right? You can revisit it. I see this in a work setting a lot, where people feel this pressure in the meeting to like say it. So my whole thing is, even if you don't know at that moment, you know whatever the feeling is around the discomfort. So sometimes I'll just say, I haven't thought this all the way through, but I feel really uncomfortable with what was just said. So I need to put that out there, and then maybe we can come back to it. Usually other people do too, but they just don't want to say anything. In some of the microaggressions literature, they talk about how in the workplace, women are interrupted more than men. So I'm on a cabinet with a lot of men, and so I've had to teach my 2 good allies, right? Like, look, you need to, A, build your awareness. So a fish doesn't know it's wet. So you need to, like, build your awareness on noticing when I'm getting interrupted. Because you're thinking we're having a dynamic conversation, right? And we're just engaged in a, like, dialogue. And I'm, like, feeling oppressed. So A, you need to build, right, your radar. And B, you need to interrupt it. So it would need to come back to things like, you know what, I noticed Yoshiko just got interrupted. I want to make sure we capture, right? That's how you use your privilege for good. Don't just talk about how you care about it. And I think when folks come forward and they say, how do I support your work or your community, that we need to give them very specific things they can do. Like, okay, you can interrupt it. You can say something. But this kind of catch-22 or do nothing is really important. But I see it a lot of times when I present, women will be like, yes, we do get interrupted a lot, right? Or you make a point, and then someone makes the same point, and everyone's like, that was a great idea. And you're thinking, I just made that dang point, right? Well, that's another talk. We'll go into that. Perpetrators of microaggressions, those who commit microaggressions, often don't realize they've offended someone. So they really don't know, or they'll view it as very trivial. Right? You're so emotional. Don't be so sensitive. We hear that in a lot of the literature on joking. Right? It's just a joke. We're just having fun. When called on it, tend to deny it or say, no, it wasn't that. It was this. And then I think you alluded to this intent versus impact, this focus on, well, that wasn't my intention or their intention, which is really irrelevant because the impacts are the same. Right? So that's really important, that perpetrators often don't know that they've done that. Now, once they know and they continue to do it, that's a different, right? That moves into a different venue. Any questions before we shift into environmental or institutional types of microaggressions, or a comment? Okay, so feel free. We don't have to be old school. Y'all can interrupt. You're being so polite, which is great, but you can interrupt me as I go if there's a comment you'd like to make. So let's talk about institutional microaggressions. They're also called environmental microaggressions. So Yoso Smith and Seha define them as the racially marginalizing actions and inertia of the university evidenced in structures, practices, and discourses that endorse a campus racial climate hostile to people of color. So it's the failure, right, what the college or university fails to do that is actually a microaggression, because it continues to privilege in their work white students while marginalizing students of color. We could insert other social identity or other identity groups, right, still privileging the dominant group. So I think that's really critical, because this is where things can get a little sticky and more difficult for people to see them, right? Because it's more comforting to know, like, oh, the issue is that you and I just don't know each other that well. Right? And we have differences. And once we understand our differences, everything's going to be, that does nothing to change the structure. We might have a better relationship, but it doesn't change the structured inequity that we're talking about, right? So that's what I call the food, fun, and famous people approach to diversity, right? Where we're like, we're going to have an ethnic potluck, and then we're going to do like a talent show from different countries. And those things are fine. They're important. But if that's all you're doing, then you're not doing the systemic work, right? You're keeping it at a very surface level. And those things really just please, right, the dominant group anyway. Have you ever seen that, I don't know if it's a short video, but it talks about the difference between education and training. and it uses a dog as an example. So when the master teaches their dog how to fetch a ball that really is for the master's pleasure, does nothing for the dog or their life. When the dog teaches their pups how to like protect themselves or eat, right? That's education, right? That's something that's going to help their quality of life. In the community college context, I think that's one of the things we struggle with, is this, there's so much pressure to be like, help them get a job, help them get a job, help them get a job, right? We just need to create a labor force. So are we training folks or are we educating folks? What they argue is that microaggressions in institutions, that the most harmful ones tend to be in the classroom between teacher and student, right? So my understanding is you have a large kind of commuter campus feel, some residential component, but a lot of your students come here and they're going to class and they're going off campus to take, other things, right? So on a commuter campus, that's even more critical. The classroom becomes even a more critical space. So they talk about the microaggression that occurs between a student and a teacher, or between students and the faculty member does nothing, are the most harmful. So we had an issue on my campus last spring where 2 African-American male students showed up to chemistry class on the first day, and the white faculty member approached them and said, "Are you lost?" I'm like, are you kidding me? Right? So why them? Right? Why did you identify them? And what they felt was this was another incident, right, in the long series of things that have happened to them where they're not welcome there. Microaggressions also show up in spaces of engagement. At my campus, it's like the library, right? There's like certain pockets that we all kind of know about, and yet nothing really changes. They manifest via an ethnocentric and Eurocentric curriculum. So my partner has a PhD in sociology, and he didn't have one class that talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of American sociology, right? He has a PhD, right? So they teach the big 3, Durkheim, Weber, Marx, right? So now he always says, they hired me to teach white sociology, but I don't, right? He teaches the big 4, so he teaches Du Bois. And then when his students go on and transfer, sometimes they'll like email him or come by and see him and say, I was in sociology and they were doing the big 3, and I said, no, it's a big 4. Those are cool things to get back, because most people teach the way they were taught, and most people were taught from a very ethnocentric or Eurocentric curriculum, right? And we teach the scholars in that field. So we just kind of perpetuate this. One of the things I tell students is Google. You have the benefit. I used to have to go to the library and like a Dewey Decimal System and stuff. Like, get out your smartphone. Like, just Google once you get your syllabus on the first day and read about who you're studying. And then if it's in a very homogeneous group, ask your professor, did any other people contribute to this field? Because it looks like we're going to study pretty much the same types of people. That's something you can do. Can I bring in other scholars? Lack of faculty and staff of color. We'll talk about this a little bit in the end, but this is, something that everywhere I speak, this is the #1 issue people want to talk to me about, diversifying their faculty and staff, and then distribution of resources. So I think we see this from a college setting. So when I was at Highline, they used to teach African American studies. It was a 3-quarter series. It was a great class. And then the person retired, and I just thought, they'll just get someone else to teach it. So the first quarter went by, no African American studies offered. The second quarter. The third quarter, I go to the vice president of instruction, like, what's up? Like, I have students that I want to take this class. And he said to me, well, we really want to offer it, but we just can't find anyone to teach it since so-and-so retired. So my response was, we would never say, we used to offer math. That was so nice, right? We used to offer math, but Yoshiko retired, and we just haven't been able to fill it, right? That's the priorities. Our values are prioritized at the point of execution. And when someone leaves, and that something they were doing that was important to the college isn't happening anymore, that tells you it was never systemic. Right? It was just that one person. But I think that's a great example. I was like, we would never say, we used to offer writing. Like, gosh, Jim, we should offer writing again. That was a really important course, right? But somehow African American experience is like, well, if we could. So eventually they got someone to teach it. Some of the consequences of institutional microaggressions, and I think this is a great point, that rarely are racism, sexism, ableism, and heterosexism explicitly named among the reasons for differences and gaps, right? Never do we call this out, where we say, oh, well, one reason why there might be differences between like black males and white males in terms of academic achievement has to do with racism. So we say things like socioeconomic background, or 1 or 2 parent home, or K through 12, and higher ed is famous for this. We blame everything on high schools, right? There's like the literature around that goes, they came to us already broken, right? K through 12, they're underprepared anyway. Or the cultural deficiency argument, right? They come from cultures that don't value education. So we just need to help them understand the value, when the literature actually does not support this, that many communities see the value, particularly poor and brown communities, see the value of education as the equalizer, as the way to improve their lives. It's clear. Or we say they're just not motivated students. They're not motivated, right? All of those leave Evergreen State College, Bellevue College off the hook. We're not responsible for any of that. So we have to name it if we really want to address that. And part of that means is being able to be uncomfortable, which is really important. So, have anyone seen this study? Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? It was a labor market study to test discrimination in the labor market. I just love talking about this study, so I think it kind of fits here. But I wanted to give an example of an institutional microaggression. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, they set out to measure racial discrimination in the labor market. So they sent out 5,000 resumes, half with white-sounding names, which they identified as Emily and Greg, half with black-sounding names. As if it's funny because I can see all your faces. So it's really, people are like, we know the difference in the names, Yoshiko. We know what the black sound is. Speed it up, 5 o'clock, and I have a question. All right, it's good, we're almost there. Hang with me. And half with black sounding names. So they responded to over 1,300 help wanted ads. The resumes were identical except for the name, and they did at different levels, like entry-level positions and more senior-level positions. And what they found, they set up a callback center, and the white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks. Same resume. So my name's Yoshiko. Most people think, right, I'm Japanese, and on the phone, most people think I'm white, right? So I didn't know it was gonna pay off later. I mean, I was like harassed my whole life, and now I make all the calls in my house, right? Trying to mitigate for potential discrimination. So when we show up to get a house, sometimes people are like, oh, or they'll say, because they're waiting for Yoshiko and Daryl, right? And I don't fault people, I mean, I would too, but the point is we need to problematize that shortcut. You know, it's like we create that pause. It's like, why am I just assuming that Yoshiko means the person is, and what does that mean, right? Does it mean anything? Is it changing the way I'm acting? But I love this study. There's another good one called Mark of a Criminal Record, where it looks at employability, white men without a criminal record, white men with, black men without. So they tested it. So white men with and white men without were higher than black men without a criminal record. And it's a fascinating article. So I want to talk a little bit about things you can do, I think, on an individual level to disrupt the status quo. People have to do this at their comfort zone, but interrupt jokes, comments, remarks. I think we heard a couple of good examples, like, of course you can. Can I touch your hair? Right? Or you just don't get the joke. One of my favorite things to do is someone makes a joke and I'll be like, don't get it. You know, because they start to get uncomfortable because they're counting on me like getting like, who's the bad driver, right? I'll be like, I'm just not, like, can you say it one more time? Like, no, I'm still not with you, but I love jokes. I really want to know. You know, so it's like you can do things like that. It doesn't always have to come in like the full frontal execute justice, although that approach works too. But, you know, I mean, some of us aren't comfortable with that approach. I think if you're starting at kind of an awareness level, just identifying kind of ways to challenge systems, policies, procedures. And the group I was meeting with earlier, one of the things I love to do is ask someone when they say, oh, we can't do that, I love to go, okay, is that a policy or a preference? Because, and I've been guilty of it too, right? Somehow our preferences, especially if you've been somewhere long enough, our preferred way of doing it somehow becomes the departmental policy, and then you go back, it's actually not a policy, it's just how they like to do it, right? So that's a great strategy. Because if it's a policy, then your strategies need to be a little different than if it's just, well, Jim prefers that. And then it just becomes like the way we do things. This is a quote from Jay Mace, a trans activist and poet, and I love it. He says, be more invested in justice than your own comfort. So a lot of it is trying to manage that. You know, Dr. King talked about in Where Do You Go From Here, Chaos or Community, where he realized at the end of that was his last book, he realized that actually progressive whites weren't interested in equity, or equality was the term. They were mostly interested in just managing the dissonance. That just enough equality to feel good about themselves, it was what he said. And I would say managing that dissonance, being able to be uncomfortable, all you're experiencing is discomfort, that's it. Stop believing you can interpret someone else's experiences better than they can. Woo, if we could do this, right? There's a lot that goes along. I saw a little clap, all right. Oh, we raised the roof. When I do that, my daughter tells me, people don't do that anymore. But now I'm gonna tell her we do it at Evergreen State College. And that's a college. You're just in high school. She'll be like, Mom, don't do it. No one raises the roof. I'm like, we raise the roof because it's timeless. So thank you for that. You affirmed me today. I appreciate that. But really just at an individual level, pausing and that like, well, that's not what it was. Like what if, suspend your disbelief. What if what they're sharing with you is true? Title IX is under my office, and it's been interesting as we're trying to employ kind of the new federal mandates around Title IX, so that's sexual harassment, stalking, sexual discrimination, gender identity. And I've told other administrators, like, you need to see these students as if they were someone you care about. That's how you need to think. Not like, oh, well, the college doesn't need to do protection orders, right? And I always say, how would you want the administrators at your son or daughter's school to say, oh, well, we don't have to do protection orders, so we're not? Or would you like them to say, you know what, this might be the only time this person can get served, where they can get their protection order, because we've already talked to the faculty member, and the faculty member says, yeah, he's in school all the time. He's here every day. So you're right. Of course, we don't have to do it, right? But it's another level. I want to touch for a few minutes on just strategies that I've employed, either led or with others in my time at Bellevue. Felix wanted me to touch on recruitment and hiring practices. So when I got to Bellevue College, so Bellevue College has a goal to have our faculty more closely mirror our student demographic around race. So currently we have about 44% students of color, and let me do the math, 79% white faculty. So there's a big gap there. Now, in an I-200 state, we cannot say a quota, right? But we can say we want to more closely mirror our student demographic. So I've done some work around, don't be afraid of the word mandatory. Is this the type of campus that gets afraid of mandatory? Yes? Okay, that is a barrier to creating more equitable spaces. So one of the first things we did was yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so, yes. So I'm not an expert on I-200. So I-200 basically said we can't consider race in admissions or contracts or hiring. So it was built around this colorblind ideology that we have to treat all people the same. I'm actually working with a group of educators, Felix and others, that we're trying to reframe the narrative on I-200 and say, actually, I-200 is creating race preference for white people in our community and technical college system. Because overwhelmingly what we're seeing is a preferential hiring from a particular group. It's just not people of color. So that's the argument we're trying to make with I-200. And a lot of times, like this assistant attorney general or other people will say, oh, well, I-200. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, like, let's at least push it. So one of the things I say to my president is that if we were 79% black faculty, people would think that was unusual. They would think that we had a hiring preference from a particular group. They would think we taught from a black-centered curriculum, that we weren't teaching from a broad and diverse curriculum, and that in fact, in higher ed, we would be an historically black college or university, right? There's even another distinction. But one of the ways whiteness operates is invisibilized, is that's just seen as, we just can't get more people, right? And I'm saying we need to problematize that. So these are some things. So one of the things at Bellevue College is if you want to participate on a screening committee, you have to go through implicit bias training. It's mandatory. So prior to that, because a lot of times diversity efforts are voluntary, and what we get are people who are already right in the choir. Who's here would I self-identify as in the choir, right? So if it was mandatory, a lot more people would be here, right? It was like, you're not gonna get your paycheck tomorrow, right? People come. So mandatory is effective. To date, we've trained about over 400 and something employees. I know we would not have that many people going through that training if it was voluntary. So that's been a very important initiative. I also started tracking demographics for our faculty searches, because some of the misnomers around diversifying your faculty are things like, I don't know, maybe you all have heard this. Everybody wants to hire a black and brown person. They don't say it like that, right? Like the competition is fierce to get, when the literature actually doesn't support that. I've read many studies around faculty of color who say they don't feel as if everyone wants them, and the offers aren't pouring in, right? Now that is not true for like the superstar faculty, right? The one that pops up, Cornell West, or the person who's the latest, right? Yes, they are being recruited, but they're tending to be recruited by the very selective, very prestigious, right? The Ivies is where they tend to go. That's one of the narratives. The other one is, well, it's because our salaries are so low. So that's true. In my system, the salaries are low for faculty, but that impacts all candidates, not just faculty of color. And this goes back to this reluctance to really name racism as one reason people don't get hired. And I say that in many meetings. Okay, before we go too far down a rabbit hole, that it's because human resources take so long for a posting. By the time they've posted, people have already accepted offers from other places. Discrimination is one reason people don't get hired. And I hear the stories all the time. We have a process where we have a pluralism rep on each screening committee, and they're the person to kind of like be the eyes and ears, steer things back. I review every single tenure track faculty application and make recommendations. So we've inserted that. Now, these things sound really lovely. I'll tell you, in the 3 years we've done it, what I have seen is that at application, our pools are very diverse. At screened in by HR, our pools are still very diverse. At invited to interview by the committee, the semifinalist round, our pools are still looking pretty good. Other than those positions that are very hard, like for us, nursing is very difficult to recruit for. It's at move forward to the president for finalists where we see a drop-off of 0 people of color every year, which tells me something significant. I'm not even a math person. The probability that you could have 180 people apply for an English tenure track position, 95 screened in, right? That means they're qualified. 10 to 15 interviewed, and 0 put forward as a finalist tells me something significant is really happening at the screening, the departmental level in the academic departments that I'm not in, right? That's the backstage where they say, yeah, we got to do this training, and yeah, but what we really need is someone who can teach calculus, right? They have a different set of priorities, or we want more people like us, right? So we don't feel comfortable with that person. Ben Simone talks about equity-minded practitioners are missing in higher ed. She argues that we need to reframe student success as a learning problem of the institution versus a learning problem of the student. Right now, it's framed as we just need to teach them to navigate the system. Paul Gorski says it better. He says we need to stop trying to change marginalized students and instead change the conditions that marginalize them, right? We need to stop trying to get students to act more like us. We just need to teach them how to navigate the system. I hate that phrase, right? Does nothing to dismantle the system. It keeps everything in play as it is, and then we just need to teach you how to get through it so you can be successful. One of the things that we have, my first year at Bellevue, I volunteered to get on the collective bargaining agreement. Is it a bargain contract here with faculty? Okay, so I was on the administration side. And I thought, oh, this will be, sometimes I can be naive. I'm like, oh, this will be cool. Like, I want to be a president one day. And I had I didn't come through faculty. Do you ever do these internal dialogues? So I'm going to just volunteer. So I got on it. I was like, oh my gosh. It was way out of my comfort zone. And then a couple people of the lead people left, so they actually wanted me to negotiate. I'd never done it before. And the way they do negotiation, it's not a direct communication, which I really struggle with. And it was very hostile. But one of the things that we got was that tenure track faculty all have to complete 33 hours of educational equity professional development, mandatory as part of their tenure process, which has been really cool, and I run that series. For faculty that are already tenured, or they're full-time non-tenured or adjunct, they can opt in to take ed equity, and everyone is compensated $1,000. So it's trying to find this balance of incentive and consequence, right? And we're trying to find that sweet spot. We also, out of my office, I have a great faculty member who's running a Social Justice Leadership Institute, Dr. Sayumi Irie, and this one is targeted towards folks from underrepresented communities that work on campuses, so director level and below, and kind of preparing for succession planning, right? Because those folks don't tend to get the professional development, right? It goes to the people who are getting the most resources. I get tons of professional development. It's an expectation that I'm gonna be out on the national doing stuff on behalf of the college. I'm not the person that actually needs the most professional development. So we're in our third year of the Social Justice Leadership Institute. It's open to all colleges. So it's not just something for Bellevue. So that's been a really cool initiative. These are the questions that I'm leaving with you. I didn't know that it was only 2, so you guys can pick the ones you like. I woke up about 3 o'clock in the morning. I was like, I gotta do my questions. So I can't, I was like, I gotta make sure they're good. So I thought some that might be useful from this discussion were thinking about identifying institutional forms of microaggressions that are at play at Evergreen State College. Where do we see those barriers? What's an institutional type versus an individual type? A conversation around what are the impacts for microaggressions for students of color? All right, how does that play out in their academic process? And I love this one. One thing I never want to hear a person say to me again about me or someone in my group. Thinking about if values are prioritized at the point of execution, then what does this college really value? So looking at what the espoused values are versus what decisions are made and what values they are they incongruent or are they congruent? Thinking about it that way. And then what do you need from college administration and leadership to move equity work forward? Right, so one of the things we talked about earlier, and I see this happen again and again in colleges and universities, is that we have people who are in decision-making roles, and then we have the content experts, and they're not necessarily the same people. Nor do they ever really come across each other in a systemic way, an intentional way. So we have an Ed Services cabinet with all our academic deans and some of the VPs, and they talk about how we need to really be looking at students with disabilities and students of color. And I'm like, okay, that's phenomenal. We don't have anyone here who provides that service. We don't have any of the content experts at this table. And so they'll say, well, we have you. And I say, okay, that's great, but I don't provide any direct service to students, right? Students are our biggest stakeholders, and rarely do we engage them in things that impact them. We might do it later, like around strategic planning, you bring on that one student, right? Or, right, if we remember, right? This happens with diversity work too. You get at the end of a college initiative, and then someone says, you didn't mention anything about diversity, an espoused value. Oh, you're right. So my college, we're redoing our governance process, And so they went through a whole thing, and they're going to go like to councils and committees, and so they wanted to meet with all the vice presidents to get like their feedback. They didn't have a council on diversity and inclusion. I'm like, okay, well, you don't have a council. Well, isn't it just organic? You know, people think it's like this. I'm like, no, it's not organic. Like, we, right, offer instruction, and yet we have one on instruction, right? So, no, clearly there are things we want to call out explicitly. So they added one. But just, you know, things like that, I think. Hopefully these questions will be a platform for some good conversation. That's the end of my formal conversation talk. And I think we have a few minutes for questions or comments or feedback. I want to thank you all for your time today. I really appreciated the opportunity to speak with you. This is my cell number. Don't call me at work, as Felix told everybody and your mama, I'm changing jobs. But you can call me if you just want to talk, whatever. I'm happy. Sometimes it helps to process something with someone who's external to your environment. And that's my email, my personal email. So any questions or comments?
So all I had to have done is gone to one of your talks in the past, and I would have been that easy to get your number, where I had to wait 6 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was easy. Yeah. It's possible. So I think the thing about individual microaggressions are that it's not something that just like white people do, right? Microaggressions can happen intra-race, intra-ethnic group. So that's the piece. I would point you to Pam Hayes. She has a great model called the addressing model, which is like an acronym for like age, disability. Basically, it looks at agent and target identities. And what she argues is that we all have agent identities where we gain privilege, and we all have target identities where we experience oppression and marginalization. And it's 10 different groups in the addressing model. So when I do so it's like college educated, native English speaker, age, temporarily able-bodied or cognitive ability, right? What they say in disability movements is that we will all experience temporary or permanent disability at some stage in our life, right? So that's a temporary stage. What are the other ones? Gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, citizenship. So when I do Pam Hayes' addressing model, I have actually 8 agent groups where I have just privilege. I have 2 where I experience oppression, race and gender. Now what she says is that your most salient identities tend to be those where you experience the most oppression. Right? So my very salient identities for me are race and gender, because that's where I experience the most marginalization. To your point, can you be in a setting and not be in the dominant group? I would, absolutely. So if you're talking about the context of this college, right, you can leave this college and in broader society still gain all of the benefits of that dominant identity group that you might not experience here. Does that make sense? So there's actually some agency in, you don't necessarily have to be in that context, right? So I can go to another country. Sometimes when people travel, they experience what to be in a minority group is for the first time. So when I was in college, I traveled. I lived in the Caribbean, in St. Thomas for a while. I had a boyfriend down there. That was a whole nother story. But when I got there, I hadn't been, so even though I was American and that was a distinction, even though that's part of a US territory, but I was from the mainland United States, I had this experience where I was like, oh, like this is what white women feel like in Seattle, right? Like visible, welcome, non-threatening, right? So like being a person of color for me, I was either hyper visible, that wasn't in a good way, or just invisible. So I experienced some marginalization around being from the United States, right? Because of the history of colonization. But when I left and moved back to California, you know, it was only temporary, right? I was fine. I wasn't like, oh, you're from the United States. It was only in that context. Does that kind of get to what you're saying? Okay. Yeah. Wow, that's a deep. Okay, so humor is actually one strategy I think people use to try and cope. So for me, it's a coping mechanism. I think since my career has been in diversity work, there's an expectation that I'm going to be pushing things forward. So when I talk to my colleagues who are like in financial aid, who are also trying to push things forward, sometimes they get pushback like, this isn't, that doesn't have anything to do with your work. So no, you don't need to be on that committee. So I think I gained some of that. So I'll tell you two things that were big shifts for me in my career. One is when I stopped trying to manage people's perceptions of me, I got a lot better at my job. So I realized I was spending a lot of energy trying to manage what people thought of me, and it wasn't working out, right? Because if I could manage perceptions, I'd manage for everyone to think I was like competent and smart and good at my job, and that wasn't necessarily all the feedback I was getting. And then when I started talking to my male colleagues, white male colleagues and colleagues of color, male colleagues, and I would say things like, do you ever go home at night and feel bad? Like, do you ever think like, oh, at that meeting I interrupted Joe and he wanted to make a point? And they're like, no. I'm like, no, really, because I was spending a lot of energy worried about it, right? Well, you don't? Like, we had an agenda and we didn't get to everything, and do you ever feel bad? And they're like, no, I'd never feel bad. It was across the board. So I know, it's not like scientific, but it was enough for me to understand that there was a gender dynamic happening around making sure kind of women, one of the ways women are socialized, making sure people feel comfortable, right? Being nice. I focus this talk around race, but around gender microaggressions, being told to smile at work. Like this, like, oh, you should smile. I'm like, I'm at work. Like, we ain't in Hawaii. And then I'm dealing with your BS. Like, no, there's no smiling here. And I was on 405 for 90 minutes this morning. But this kind of like, oh, or, you're you must be PMSing. Like those types of things. So when I stopped trying to manage people's perceptions, I got a lot better at my job. And then I had to work a lot to depersonalize. So things around, things you care about, and then something happens, it can feel very personal. So I've had to try and create more distance between personalizing it. And I spend a lot of time thinking, okay, what's my goal in this situation? And then my actions should support that goal. So if my goal is to like break you down to your barest molecule because you did something wrong, okay, then I should do that. But if my goal is that actually we move the college forward, then breaking you down to your barest molecule actually might not be the best strategy to meet the goal. And that's where I've had to break things up. And now I'll tell people things like, I'm a direct communicator. And so people sometimes will get uncomfortable. So now I'll say things like, how direct do you want me to be? So I put it back on them because I was actually taking on a lot of stuff, right? Like, and they're like, well, really, no one ever says don't be direct at all. Actually, I have one colleague who says, stop filling my head with facts. And my mind's already made up, Yoshiko. But, most people say, I want you to be direct. And so I'll say, okay, I'm going to proceed very directly. Like, it's not that to try, because I really do want it to be better. I don't want us to get caught off in your style. So a lot in diversity work is like I don't have a problem with what you said. It's how you said it. So let me get this straight. I just broke down like race, oppression, structural inequity, and your issue is my tone? No issue with any of this. Right? But it's my tone that got you tripping? Come on, get out of here. That's how. Yeah, so I call that like the meeting before the meeting. You ever do this? Like you're like, all right, before we go in this meeting, you're gonna say this, and then I'm gonna say this. But we're acting like we're just talking about this, but I've already decided, right? Or if you experience it on the other end, like, they said this was about making a decision, but it seems like things are made up. Like, I missed that meeting. So there's a lot of, things people do before the meeting, but it's under this guise of, this is open and transparent, and we want everyone's voices. So I think, for me, I don't know if I can break into the back stage. So a lot of times people don't tell me directly the problems they have with initiatives that I'm leading at the college. Now, where I do hear is from my white allies. And they'll say, just so you know, like when I was in bargaining, which is supposed to be confidential, by the way, but since it's not, I'll put all the business out there. Okay. So one of my white allies, who's a faculty member, came to me and he said, look, I just want you to know that there's a discussion going around amongst faculty that you aren't in support of faculty at the bargaining table because of your body language. I was like, what? I was to your point where I'm always like, yeah, you just don't take it personal. That was personal. I was upset. Like, what are you talking, like my body language is conveying lack of support for faculty? So that was an example where if my colleague hadn't told me, you know, to kind of like just be prepared, they might be coming for you because this narrative is what's being crafted and could be very problematic. So I think that's where allyship is really important. And I think we have to look at allyship as a political act. It's not a friendship, necessarily. You could have a friend and an ally, but you can be an ally to someone and it's not a friendship, right? It's just that your interests align, and so you're willing to work together. I was talking with some other colleagues that it would be cool to create a scale of allyship. So it's like ally, agitator, activator, like calling it, there's levels to this because not everyone is, some people are good enough with using their institutional power to provide resources. That's a form of allyship. But they're not going to be the person that says to the meeting, this is racist, we're not doing it, right? That might be an agitator. That's a different form of allyship. So thinking about, it takes all of us, and we all have different skills, and what you can do within your own sphere to problematize it. My best success has been with, I feel really uncomfortable with the direction we're going in. And I just want that noted. We had a issue recently with, they hired someone at the college who admitted in their interview process to engaging in an illicit act at their previous job. And we hired him, you know, and so I just basically just called out my president and sent it to him. Like, I Googled this person, it's come to my attention, what do you want to do about it? So that's, you know, he wants to keep his plausible deniability, so now we had a meeting and I think that person's going to be moving on from the college. Like, if this shows up on the front page of Seattle Times, are we prepared to? That's my worst nightmare, that it's going to be like, Bellevue College failed too, and then it's going to be my picture. So I don't know if I can get to the, backstage in that way. But if you and I were partners, we could. That gets us to 5 o'clock. Oh, I don't know, what's the culture here? Are people real timely? Like, you guys got to school me, like at 5 o'clock is what the poster said?
Yoshiko, we're timely when it's time to get off. But when it's time to
Okay.
come, we have a different frame perspective of when it's to be at work, you know what I'm saying? But time to get off, it's like the freeway.
Is it time to get off? Yes. All right, well, if you have a comment, I'm happy to talk to you one-on-one. Thank you so much. Have a great day.